Every once in a while, you will experience something that sticks with you for years. These are surprising, emotionally scarring events that no matter what you do, you can't shake. You try to move on from them or try something different and new, but it doesn't work because the old thing is still haunting you. It may be an ex-girlfriend that you're stuck on, or a family relative that left your childhood tainted, or even a novel or piece of entertainment. It takes a permanent seat in your mind and refuses to leave. You can try to fight it, but it's staying and inevitably will demand your acceptance. Most of us have experienced one such haunting, for better or worse, and have been permanently affected by the experience. You probably even have something in your mind's eye right now, something which you've been carrying with you for years and years. You don't talk about it to anyone except on very sacrosanct occasions. Rather, you keep it buried, despite its innumerous effects on you. It also isn't always a bad thing. For example, I remember in high amounts of detail every element of the setting when I was 14 and won the state chess championship. I felt like all the years of work I had poured into this game had finally paid off. It was pure euphoria, and it has stuck with me for years despite being a positive experience. These events, which affect us so deeply, are what I find incredibly interesting and are the very things upon which this video is focused. Not much affects us the way that these aforementioned examples do, and so when something does, as you would expect, it refuses to leave you. And as I said, these events can be triggered by any number of things, whether it's a song, a girl, a boy, a dog or cat, a play or movie, or even a video game. They all can have the same cumulative effect. And guess what? The latter is what I'm getting at. Normally when somebody sits down to play a game, they are out to have fun, whatever that means. They are prepared to participate in certain repetitive actions with linked rewards that will trigger dopamine in the brain and in turn give a sense of satisfaction and fulfillment that is often defined as fun. We're rarely looking to participate in a deeply emotional experience. Even a game like The Witcher 3, which has its own fair share of emotional moments, fills the overwhelming majority of its gameplay time with, well, gameplay. Even a narrative game has this obligation, and this is actually part of the reason why games can be such effective narrative devices, even though that seems like a total non sequitur. Basically, you're playing a game, and so your defenses are almost constantly down, meaning that you are more vulnerable to emotional appeals. But more on this later. For years, game developers have been trying to perfect this process, balancing gameplay and narrative. Give players something satisfying to do over and over again, and then justify those actions within the game's world with its narrative. It's not easy, not at all, but some developers are better at it than others. In fact, it's pretty rare for a game to come along that absolutely nails it narratively. This is perhaps because the narrative-focused market is smaller than the market for what I would call junk food games that are easy to play, highly repetitive, often grindy, and lacking in any sort of direct narrative, though it may have a narrative buried discreetly within the details of the world. Regardless, there are still developers who pride themselves on delivering intense narrative experiences, such as CD Projekt Red, Don't Nod, Sony Santa Monica, and of course, the kings of narrative game development would no doubt be Naughty Dog. Naughty Dog has been making games for a long time, but they didn't always focus on the narrative side of things. Sure, all of the Uncharted games were fairly cinematic, but I would argue that cinematic and narrative priorities are not the same thing, though they can certainly benefit each other. After Uncharted 3 launched on November 1st of 2011, it was met with great reviews, but there was a common thread in the criticism of its narrative. The issue with it was that while cinematic, it was not grounded. Now, I know that this just sounds like a buzzword, so allow me to explain. What was meant by this was that the suspension of disbelief that the game requested from the player was often greater than what it prepared you for. An example being that in the game, there is a mystical djinn that has the power to possess enemies that Nathan encounters. There are also moments where Nathan sees things happen that are well beyond the realm of possibility within the world that Uncharted has established. Now, for those of you who have played Uncharted 3, you'll know that Nathan finds out that there is a large amount of hallucinogenic pathogens in the water all throughout the city at the end of the game. He actually drinks from a fountain containing this water in the beginning of the sequence, and so this actually explains most of the abnormal things that happen throughout the last act of the game. However, This is learned after everything happens. And so in the moment that you're playing it, it doesn't feel grounded in reality, but rather feels like a video game. And I think it's important to note that the Naughty Dog of today would cringe at the sound of that. And this is a very important point, so let me make this very clear. A game does not have to be realistic to be grounded. Simply, to be grounded, the game's world just has to adhere to the rules and laws that the writers have established. When Nathan starts fighting superpowered creatures that have been possessed by a djinn, it is certainly fun, definitely not realistic, but it is also not in the moment, grounded in its own world. After the fact, they explain how all of this happened with the stereotypically awful justification of saying, it was just a dream. Point being, because the narrative was not grounded in the moment, there were no solid emotional pivots to be made. But this is to be expected considering Uncharted, up to this point, had never tried to deliver an elaborate narrative experience, rather focusing on cinematics and the feeling of actively participating in a summer blockbuster. However, all of this changed with the release of one game that made Naughty Dog and everyone else rethink game design. One game that changed the way that all studios dealt with their narratives. It came out of nowhere, wasn't a part of a major franchise, was releasing in 2013 despite the console generation ending. Of course, I'm talking about Ride to Hell Retribution. This game never ceases to amaze me, with its stellar graphics, intense and gory gameplay that is endlessly interesting, and a narrative that treats everyone with respect and dignity. Sure, it received some negative reviews, but that's just fake news, and I think... Okay, yeah, no, I dragged that on for a little bit longer than I should. I'm sorry, I'm just joking. That game sucked. What I'm actually talking about is, of course, The Last of Us. I talked about a lot of this at length in my commentary of the game, but for those of you who have not seen it, I'll reiterate some of the key points now. The Last of Us was never actually expected to be a revolutionary title. In fact, there's significant evidence that Naughty Dog expected the game to be a flop, at least compared to Uncharted. The game's creative director, Neil Druckmann, is quoted as saying that he felt that, quote, "this could be the game that did Naughty Dog in," end quote. Looking back, it seems ridiculous to think that The Last of Us could have flopped, but when you put yourself into their shoes, it makes sense. Prior to this, Naughty Dog only resided in the realm of fantasy and goofy action heroes. Now, they were going to delve into an incredibly dark and dangerous world. There would be no hope, little humor, and great tragedy. It was a huge risk, but one that eventually paid off. Now, all of this begs the question, what exactly did The Last of Us do so well? Well, simply, I think the most impactful thing that The Last of Us had going for it was its ability to deliver an engaging and heart-wrenching story in what was likely the most efficient way anyone had ever seen before. It was able to efficiently balance its pacing and exhibit dialogue which was grounded and believable. The characters were real, believable, and sympathetic people, not just vain fragments of a writer's imagination. But let's be real, all of this seems to lack specificity, so let's deep dive into each of these. Now, what do I mean by pacing? Well, pacing in this context can be defined as the rate at which key moments in the story take place. Proper pace is not something for which there's a formula, however. This is because every single instance is going to be incredibly different. It can change based on the personalities of the characters in question, the time period the story is set in, and even on where on the planet the story is placed. Each of these frames the story with a certain context that defines what the story will need to be in order to be properly balanced. With The Last of Us being a dystopian post-apocalyptic zombie thriller, its needs in the narrative department will be different from what Stardew Valley would need. It's much more intense and so will need moments of levity interjected between moments of intensity. And these two contrasting moments can be made up of four basic elements: light emotional moments, heavy emotional moments, light action moments, and heavy action moments. These can certainly overlap, but usually are each their own event. For instance, you can have an emotionally charged moment followed by an action sequence that is meant to contrast what just occurred. You can also have a light action moment followed by an emotionally charged one. The point is that you don't want to have 2 hours of nonstop action or emotion because it would be overwhelming and the player would become desensitized to it. You also want to give the player enough time to process what has just occurred. Now, before I get into the examples, be warned, there are some serious spoilers ahead. A great example is the opening of the game. When Joel's daughter dies, the screen goes black and we are left to process the heavy emotional event we have just witnessed as the credits roll. Neil Druckmann said in a development diary, actually, that this was supposed to basically immediately transition into Joel waking up 2 decades later, but that they found that players were still reeling from what they had just witnessed, and so they needed something lighter to put between the two moments. In this case, they interjected a roll of credits with a voiceover explaining a bit more about the game's world. Another example would be later in the game when Joel decides that he's going to pass Ellie off on his brother because he's realizing that he can't deal with the emotions that Ellie brings up in him. He claims it's a matter of efficiency, that Tommy will get her where she needs to go faster and more safely, but Ellie doesn't buy it. And I'll let the scene just play.
Is this really all they had to worry about? Boys, movies, deciding which shirt goes with which skirt. It's bizarre.
Get up. We're leaving.
And if I say no?
Do you even realize what your life means? Huh? Running off like that, putting yourself at risk? It's pretty goddamn stupid.
Well, I guess we're both disappointed with each other then.
What do you want from me?
Admit that you wanted to get rid of me the whole time.
Tommy knows this area
Oh,
better
fuck
than...
that.
Well, I'm sorry. I trust him better than I trust myself.
Stop with the bullshit. What are you so afraid of? That I'm gonna end up like Sam? I can't get infected. I can take care of myself.
How many close calls have we had?
Well, we seem to be doing all right so far.
And now you'll be doing even better with Tommy.
I'm not her, you know.
What?
Maria told me about Sarah.
Ellie?
And
You are treading on some mighty thin ice here.
I'm sorry about your daughter, Joel. But I have lost people too.
You have no idea what loss is.
Everyone I have cared for has either died or left me. Everyone fucking except for you. So don't tell me that I would be safer with someone else, because the truth is I would just be more scared.
You're right. You're not my daughter. And I sure as hell ain't your dad. And we are going our separate ways.
Get it together. We're not alone.
There are two walking in.
There's more inside already.
They're immediately interrupted by a group of thugs, which forces the conversation to stop and allows Joel and the player to process what has just happened. As you sneak around the house picking off the enemies one by one, you realize that these two need each other and can't survive without the other's help. And so Joel changes his mind and decides to finish the trip with Ellie. Yet another phenomenal example of this is at the very, very end of the game, after Joel realizes that Marlene and her doctor friends are going to kill Ellie in an attempt to extract a cure to the cordyceps epidemic. He storms into the operating room and confronts the doctors. He saves Ellie and takes her into an elevator while running away from armed guards when he runs into Marlene in person in a parking garage below, and they have the following conversation. Please note how the scene transitions back and forth between a peaceful moment with Joel driving away and this tense moment with Joel deciding whether or not he's going to kill Marlene as she grovels on the ground like a dog.
You can't save her. Even if you get her out of here, then what? How long before she's torn to pieces by a pack of clickers? That is, if she hasn't been raped and murdered first.
It ain't for you to decide.
It's what she'd want. And you know it. Look. You can still do the right thing here. She won't feel anything.
hell am I wearing?
Just take it easy. Drugs are still wearing off.
What happened?
We found the fireflies. Turns out there's a whole lot more like you, Ellie. People that are immune. There's dozens, actually. Ain't done 'em a damn bit of good, neither. They've stopped looking for a cure. I'm taking us home. I'm sorry.
Wait! Let me go. Please.
You just come after her.
They perfectly balance this chaos and bliss in a yin-yang of narrative. It's phenomenally well done, and it deserves immense praise. Honestly, it's not easy to explain how difficult this is to do until you have tried to write your own story that needs to balance its pace. But the easiest way to understand it is to look at other games that fall far too short of proper pace. Look at a game like Vampire, a good game that has many things that it does well, but also a lot of things that it could improve. Vampire is fun, but it has trouble keeping the player engaged for extended periods of time because its pace is off. And side note, just make sure to subscribe if you want to see my upcoming critique on the game. The main point is just to say The Last of Us has great pacing and keeps the player engaged throughout the entire experience. The other thing that the game did well was that it was able to ground its characters in the world that they operated within by using dialogue that was believable and engaging. This is all thanks to one key understanding that Naughty Dog's writers obtained while working on the game, and that is that there is often more communicated in silence than in verbal exchanges. In fact, in our day-to-day lives, there have been studies that have shown that over 90% of our communication with others is nonverbal. It's based off of body posture, gestures, breathing patterns, eye contact, and even which way your head is tilted. Now, employing nonverbal communication in a format like this is incredibly difficult to do because it requires everyone within the development chain to have a vast knowledge of human behavior. But the way that Naughty Dog fixed this issue was to hire world-class actors to play the characters in the story through motion capture and very carefully directed voice acting. However, this was not a foolproof solution. At the time that they were filming these scenes, roughly 2011 to 2013, the technology at hand did not support facial capture. And so while the body and voice were captured on set, the facial animations had to be done by hand. Needless to say, this is incredibly difficult and time-consuming for a group of animators to do. Sure, they had help in the form of recordings of the motion capture sessions, but these only acted as a template for the individuals crafting the scenes. In fact, one of the animators said of this process that, quote, "there's a little bit of each animator in the characters," end quote. This could also go very badly, as we've seen in big RPG games like Mass Effect Andromeda that use much more formulaic systems for animations, or as we've seen in games with smaller dev teams like Vampire. Yes, Naughty Dog puts a lot more emphasis on its cinematic style and on the animations within each scene, especially cutscenes, but that shouldn't take away from what they accomplished here. It's very impressive, and especially at the time, was unlike anything anyone had ever seen. But all of this would have been for nothing if Naughty Dog's teams weren't able to do one simple thing: effectively tell their story. One of the things that made The Last of Us so successful in its execution was how it balanced all of the aforementioned systems with their gameplay. Now, I haven't talked about the gameplay yet, but it was integral to the game's success. By accurately pacing its gameplay with grounded and punctual cutscenes, The Last of Us was able to perform a virtual 1-2 punch to its players. This because when somebody is going through a slower sequence, their guard is down. They are highly vulnerable to an emotional event which would affect them for the rest of their journey within the game. This is employed many times in the game, but one good example is the following. Joel and Ellie are exploring an old, worn-down hotel early in the game. Joel has just snapped at Ellie for not following his directions and quite clearly doesn't trust her. It isn't necessarily that he doesn't trust her as a person, but rather that he doesn't trust his own ability to deal emotionally with the feelings that she evokes in him. This is mostly an afterthought throughout the sequence, however, as we are preoccupied with fighting off some squatters who have blockaded themselves in the building. This means that the player has become vulnerable to an emotional appeal, and so, right on time, we get one. Joel begins to climb a ladder when it is kicked down by one of the aforementioned enemies, at which point Joel and this individual fall into a small puddle within which the goon begins an attempt to drown Joel. As Joel and the player are struggling to stay alive, we're left panicking when Ellie picks up the gun that Joel dropped and shoots the perpetrator, and the following scene plays out.
I shot the hell out of that guy, huh?
Yeah, you sure did.
I feel sick.
And you just hang back like I told you to.
Well, you're glad I didn't, right?
I'm glad I didn't get my head blown off by a goddamn kid.
You know what? No. How about, hey, Ellie, I know it wasn't easy, but it was either him or me. Thanks for saving my ass. You got anything like that for me, Joel?
We gotta get going.
Lead the way.
The player and Joel are left trying to process why this upset him. Joel isn't quite sure, and neither is the player. And to help you process this, they designed the level in such a way that you explore the adjacent room where Ellie mopes around while making small quips to Joel. Here's just a few.
That's a backdrop. People would take their pictures in front of it.
Yeah, I know what it is.
Okay, then. Something on your mind, Ellie?
I wasn't trying to disobey you back there. You were taking a really long time, and I thought maybe he's gotten into trouble.
Look, it don't matter what you thought. I need you to listen to me.
I do. It's just that... Whatever, Joel.
I'll be able to get there with this. All right. Damn, this is not what I thought. Hey, how about a hand?
You sure you can trust me with that?
Ellie.
Push!
I am.
Push harder!
There, how's that?
Let's go.
This is a very small example, but this narrative tactic is used time and time again throughout the game and is highly effective. And this is the key point of this entire video. The Last of Us didn't have revolutionary gameplay or a narrative that was unlike anything anyone had ever seen before, but rather they delivered these things in such an efficient and effective way that almost everyone who played the game got out of it what they were supposed to. It's actually pretty rare to encounter a story that sticks with you for a long time. Like we said at the beginning of this video, these scars don't come easy, but when they do, they stay forever. Just think how many games, TV shows, movies, books, and songs you've seen and listened to over the last few years. How many of those have permanently impacted you in the same way The Last of Us did? Not many. That is what The Last of Us's legacy really is. It left a lasting emotional impression on millions of people with its expert design and phenomenal narrative structure. It forever changed how players and developers approach their games and continues to do so. Most games are played and forgotten, but The Last of Us was played and cherished. It truly did do something incredible.